Welcome to the Capital News. I'm your host, Alex Kreitis. Today is Wednesday, May 6, 2020. Thank you so much for joining me. The title of today's podcast is The Blame Game. We've been talking about this for quite a while. Things starting to heat up, specifically on the rhetorical side of things when it comes to COVID-19. How did it start? Where did it start? Is it an act of God? Is it man-made? If it was man-made in some laboratory, was it a mistake that it got out? Was it on purpose? All unknowns at this juncture to the general public. But people have their conspiracy theories. They have their thoughts. They're trying to connect the dots. People are frustrated the world over. People are sick. People are dying. People want answers. Governments want answers, and they are going to play the blame game because politicians do not want to take any type of responsibility for any of the destructive and flawed policies that were implemented well prior to the onset of COVID-19. So they don't want to take any responsibility for that. If the people in whatever country it might be think that their respective governments and leaders, and of course we use that word here loosely, think that those government officials didn't do a good job, well, the governments are going to say, well, it wasn't our fault. We would have done a better job had somebody told us differently. And of course that somebody is going to be China. Okay, so the blame game is going to start picking up. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, especially as economies around the world start to, quote-unquote, open up once again. And of course, this is going to be very topsy-turvy. A lot of unknowns are going to take place. Of course, our analysis here is it is not going to go back to what it was before anytime soon. And in our analysis, our opinion, it shouldn't. Not just from the health standpoint, but because it was such an unsustainable system. Unsustainable. People living beyond their means. We already know people live paycheck to paycheck, use credit cards to make ends meet, don't have $400 cash in the event of an emergency. So clearly that system before all of this was not working. Clearly those were not signs of a healthy, functioning economy. Most definitely they were not signs that could be construed as the greatest economy ever, as somebody likes to say so frequently. So connect the dots. Understand what's coming here. Politicians don't like to take responsibility, but they love to blame somebody else. And when you have an election year, especially here in this country, it's going to be get China at all costs. You already see Joe Biden, his campaign. You already see it from the Democratic side of things too. Who is going to be tougher on China? We know this was part of President Trump's, then candidate Trump's campaign in 2016 to start blaming other countries and blaming our leaders here too, which is correct, but also pointing the blame on Mexico, on China, and a whole bunch of other areas. Now that rhetoric is just going to start getting hotter and hotter. Okay, and it's going to come from China too, because we've already started seeing that out of China, blaming the United States. So this is far from over, very much in the early stages, very much simpatico with our podcast yesterday when we asked the question, war propaganda beginning, and we were highlighting again what was taking place with the back and forth rhetoric in response to COVID-19, what we were hearing from our Defense Department, our intelligence agencies, and then what we hear from the President and the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Different messages, right? And then you have all of that, perhaps a modern-day Bay of Pigs fiasco down in Venezuela. And where does that lead us moving forward? And of course, there are so many other hotbeds around the world. It's just all it's going to take is one accident, one slip of the tongue, somebody who has a happy trigger finger, and it'll be the shot heard around the world. It will not take much to set off a massive unraveling. To the market front, and then we're going to read briefly an article from the Wall Street Journal that highlights some of this blame game. So the market front, you know, these markets are cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I mean, can't make heads or tails of this junk, and that's what it is. It's all junk, it's all garbage, but it's what we have to deal with. Across the board, markets were up pretty nicely during the day. Towards the end of the day, they sell off, go into negative territory, and then at the end of the day, right before the close, they end in positive territory once again. But right now, during the futures overnight trading, we have the Dow Jones Industrial average up 0.3%. The S&P 500 is gained about 0.5%, and the Nasdaq 100 is up about 0.8%. The Japanese are back from holiday. The Nikkei 225 is up about 0.4%. Across the pond today, UK markets were flat. Germany, France, Italy, Spain, all down about 1%. Right now, the Australian markets are trading down slightly, 0.3%. On the commodity front, we have WTI trading at $24.20 a barrel, Brent at $29.94 a barrel. Natural gas is back below $2, $1.95 per million British thermal units. Gold, $1,692 an ounce. Silver, $14.98. On the bond front, U.S. 10-year Treasury note is yielding 0.7%. Okay, so we're going to continue to monitor the bond market because, of course, there is that continued divergence between what is taking place in the bond market and the stock market. Typically, the bond market has it right, but with all of the distortions, it's anybody's guess. Any type of major update with respect to the stock markets and the bond markets. This week, we will have, tomorrow's Thursday, we will have initial jobless claims, those numbers for last week. We'll find out how many more Americans filed for unemployment. Of course, over the past 6 weeks, some 30 million Americans have filed for unemployment insurance. This Friday will be the jobs report that will come out. That always comes out the first Friday of the month for the previous month. So we will get April's unemployment rate. You have estimates all over the place, but pretty much in agreement that it will be in the double digits. And of course, only a month or so ago, we were at 3.4, 3.5, 3.6%, which was a multi-decade low in the unemployment rate. So now this is going to be quite the unraveling to the other side. How significant, we will find out. Also, tomorrow we will get, hopefully, unless there's some sort of delay, an update to the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Again, that is nearing $7 trillion. We know that this number is likely to climb significantly over the weeks and months ahead, and probably years as well. Our projection, it'll probably hit $10 trillion. Do not be surprised if it hits the $10 trillion mark in the not-too-distant future, and it could very well go past that, too, because we are far from out of the woods. This is the tip of the iceberg. This is the first wave of COVID-19. Let us all hope and pray that there is not a second wave, but hope is not a strategy. So you got to be prepared for a second wave, and if history is any guide, we should expect one, because there's not any great therapy for this yet, and vaccines simply take time. There are a whole host of viruses and other issues out there that we have been dealing with for quite a while, and we still don't have great therapies, and we still do not have vaccines. So to expect scientists to come up with something extremely rapidly is optimistic. Let's hope that happens, but don't get your hopes up. Okay, so pay attention to all of this because it's all connected. So we'll get the Fed's balance sheet, and of course we discussed earlier this week, as was announced by the U.S. Treasury Department, that they will be issuing about $3 trillion worth of debt over the second quarter. $3 trillion. And again, just for some perspective, from the federal tax revenue standpoint, the U.S. federal government brings in about $3 to $3.5 trillion for the year. For the year. And we're going to borrow $3 trillion just in the second quarter alone. All right, we're on phase 4 of whatever stimulus, bailout package, whatever you want to call this junk. There's likely going to be another one, maybe multiple ones. Now, of course, some politicians are going to start saying, all right, that's enough. That's enough. That's enough. After we hit $25 trillion in a national debt, once we're projected to hit $4 trillion on a national deficit, and I imagine that number will go higher, now politicians are finally worried about the cost and who has to pay it. It's just a bunch of games, right? But guess what? There's real cost to this. Free was never so expensive. If you haven't listened to that podcast, check it out. Free was never so expensive because there is no such thing as a free lunch. And don't forget, folks, the U.S. Treasury is backstopping the Federal Reserve. So if the Federal Reserve, with all of these lending programs that they're throwing out there, all these different facilities, giving trillions of dollars to corporate America, the banking industry, everything, right? If they suffer losses, those losses will be backstopped by the U.S. Treasury, which means you and me. We're bailing them out, And if these companies can't make it going forward, which a lot of them will not be able to, despite getting a whole bunch of help, okay, they will go out of business. Federal Reserve will suffer losses. They will be made whole by the U.S. Treasury, meaning you and me. They'll be recapitalized. That's what's going on here. A financial and economic coup d'etat in our faces. Nobody says anything. Nobody says a word. And of course, these people know this. Federal Reserve, federal government. That's why they say, okay, let's give the people something this time. Let's give them $1,200, sit down, shut up money, right? That's what it is to keep people happy. Because last time, only a decade ago, during the great financial crisis, there was no quote-unquote bailout to Main Street. It was all to corporate America. It was all to Wall Street, right? Well, this time you can't have that because you're going to have pitchforks and torches in the street. So let's give people $1,200. Even though most of these people, unfortunately, live paycheck to paycheck, don't have the savings. So this is money is just making these individuals and these families pass-throughs, just turning them into middlemen to say, okay, here's your $1,200. Now you're going to go pay your debt. Well, that's a bank, right? Go pay your car payment, pay your mortgage, pay your landlord, blah, blah, blah. You're just a pass-through to some sort of financial institution on the other side of things. That's all it is. But I guess this has some sort of magical, very powerful psychological effect on people to at least think, well, at least I'm getting something this time. And that's your quote-unquote bailout. Got to wake up, people. Got to wake up. So that's that on the economic front. Of course, ADP, the payroll numbers were out today, too, with their projections. They're reading about, I think it was about 20 million Americans, of course, was off the charts of people who are unemployed. Of course, we already know, but that is sort of the front runner towards the jobs report, so we'll see what that comes out on Friday. Now to some of the blame game and the article from the Wall Street Journal. It's a pretty lengthy article. I'm not going to read all of it. You'll get the gist, but I just wanted to highlight this because you got to start paying attention to these stories if you see them come across. I don't care where you get your news. If it's anytime they start talking about this stuff, whether it's Fox, CNN, MSNBC, some other alternative media source, some other podcast, whether you read a lot of news sites off of Twitter, AP, Reuters, it doesn't matter. Pay attention to this stuff. Pay attention to this stuff because that's how they start to do it. It's drip, 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 drip. It's the lead up. It's the war machine. That's what they do all the time. It's in print, so you can go look this stuff up. You want to go look at the stories prior to getting into Iraq, go look them up. I mean, this is what they do. They start to prepare the people for what is coming. That's all it is. So here's the Wall Street Journal. Coronavirus casts deep chill over U.S.-China relations. Relations between the U.S. and China, strained for years, have deteriorated at a rapid clip in recent months, leaving the two nations with fewer shared interests and a growing list of conflicts. The Trump administration has moved to involve much of the U.S. government in a campaign that includes investigations, prosecutions, and export restrictions. Nearly every cabinet and cabinet-level official either has adopted adversarial positions or jettisoned past cooperative programs with Beijing, an analysis of their policies reveals. Chinese officials, for their part, are following through on President Xi Jinping's call last fall to resist anything they perceive as standing in the way of China's rise. They have stepped up military activities in the contested South China Sea and intimidation of Taiwan, a U.S. ally. And state media has issued extraordinary public denunciations of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who, of course, we were talking about yesterday because you had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, coming out before the Senate saying, we do not have any hard, concrete evidence that the COVID-19 virus was man-made. And, of course, you have the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying, no, we have some pretty significant evidence that this was man-made. This was in a lab in Wuhan, China. Of course, some of those remarks today were backtracked by the Secretary of State. So it's very interesting to see how this is going to be played out. It's always a misinformation, disinformation campaign. Again, is this a question of politics or a question of policy? Time will tell. But we're talking about people's lives here, so this is a big deal. Continuing, the coronavirus pandemic has deepened the rancor, bringing relations between the two to a modern-day nadir. Both governments are forging cooperation and trying to outmaneuver each other to shape events in the post-pandemic world order. President Trump, who has sharply criticized China for its handling of the outbreak, has said he is considering using tariffs and other ways to collect compensation for it from Beijing. though senior officials signaled this week that the administration is holding off on punishing China economically. At least that's what they say publicly, right? Because there's a whole host of things. It's not just going to be, and I hope it's not military. It can be other things. It can be economic warfare. It can be cyber warfare. And there's no question that both of those things are taking place now. Both of those things, economic warfare and cyber warfare, have been taking place between these two nations and others for quite a while. The question is, will this turn into a hot kinetic war where we're talking guns, bullets, and bombs? Let's hope that does not happen. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian has publicly speculated that the U.S. military unleashed the virus in China, an idea amplified by state media but described as absurd by the Pentagon. A new State Department report concludes that Beijing and its allies are mounting a disinformation campaign against the U.S. over the outbreak. So there you have it, folks. Our State Department is claiming that Beijing is mounting a disinformation campaign against the United States. Can we say the same thing about our State Department against China? I mean, this is all it is. It's the back and forth. This is the blame game. We're not there. We do not have these documents. We are not there in these meetings. The truth is always the first casualty of war. Always. Supporters of the U.S.'s harder-edged China policy say it is working, producing a partial trade deal in which Beijing has promised to buy more American goods and services. More broadly, they say the approach is deterring Beijing by demonstrating strength and resetting relations that previously tilted in China's favor. So it'll be interesting to see what the Trump administration does in regards to whether or not they put on more tariffs on Chinese goods. You know, we had that discussion earlier this week as well in the podcast, The Real Economy, because we had that 60 Minutes episode on Sunday where they were talking to farmers and a whole bunch of Americans who've lost their jobs. We also focused on the Fox News virtual town hall with the president, the vice president, and the Treasury Secretary. All the back and forth, thinking that tariffs are a good thing, think it's something that's great to bring China to the negotiating table. That might be the case in some instances, but there is damage on the other side. Farmers closing up shop, especially your smaller farmers. Again, that one farmer who was breaking down in tears because he's aware of so many people who are committing suicide because the family farm is no longer. So this has real ramifications, real consequences when we engage in these types of trade wars. And of course, then you have the rhetoric from the president saying it's never been a better time to be a farmer in the country. So, you have these messages that just are not simpatico. They are in stark contrast to each other. And reality is going to start to kick in and sink in sooner rather than later. Continuing, some officials and many foreign policy experts worry that mutual suspicions are fraying any remaining shared interests. Quote, the general feeling in China is that the United States does not want China to stand up as a global power. End quote, said Wang Shiji, president of Peking's University Institute of International and Strategic Studies. About 2/3 of Americans have an unfavorable view of China, according to a Pew Research Center survey of 1,000 Americans conducted in March. That is the most negative assessment since Pew began asking the question in 2005, and a nearly 20 percentage point increase since the Trump administration took office. Positive views of China's Mr. Xi also are at new lows. Members of Mr. Trump's re-election campaign want to make his tough China policy a central issue. They believe it appeals to working-class supporters and ties his presumed Democratic opponent, former Vice President Joe Biden, to what many in Washington characterize as the Obama administration's more accommodating posture to Beijing. So that's why you're already seeing the Democrats, the Biden campaign, putting out ads, talking tough on China. So what is this going to be about? This is the month of May. Come November, we have a presidential election. Seems like an eternity from here because of what's been taking place so far this year. But we are going to have an election. This is going to be front and center, especially if there is a second wave, because if a second wave takes place, well, it's got to come after the first one, and we're still in the first one. So once we start to reopen, and if things get worse, and there is a second wave, presumably that's going to take place late summer, sometime in the fall, which is when we have the election. So there is a lot up in the air. The rhetoric is going to get nasty. It's going to get nasty on all sides. Makes no difference whether it's here in the United States going after China, whether it's the Chinese coming after us. Just buckle up. This is the blame game, and who knows what else is going to be played out. Will there be proxy wars, right? Two key targets as far as I'm concerned. Of course, I could be wrong, but if there are proxy wars with this between the United States and China, it could take place in Iran, could take place in Venezuela, might take place also in the South China Sea and some other country there too, because China is trying to get a greater foothold in their backyard, which, I mean, logically speaking, is not surprising, right? They do not like the United States having this naval superiority in their backyard. We wouldn't like it if China was in the Gulf of Mexico. They don't like it that we and other countries are in the South China Sea. All right? So this is just what is taking place. This is the balance of power, right? China wants to be a superpower. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The United States is a superpower. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now, when it comes to naval superiority, it's us by 1.5 miles. China doesn't stand a chance, not even close. That's why it's unlikely that these two nations, the United States and China, are going to go at it in a military battle, in a military conflict, because China really doesn't stand a chance. That's why, but if they go through other unconventional means, economic warfare, cyber warfare, potentially even bio warfare, well, maybe they're on more of an even leg. Time will tell. Let's hope none of this plays out, but drip, drip, drip. Wall Street Journal, AP, Reuters, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, pay attention to these stories. Pay attention to what is being said by whether it's the CIA, the NSA, State Department, DOD. Put it all together. Put it all together. And don't allow patriotism to blind you either, because everybody thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It's a slam dunk, sir. And look at the destruction that we've caused there, and all of the blowback and everything else that's been taking place since 2003, since we got involved with that. And then lastly, because we have a handful of other things that's taking place, I'm going to finish up with a couple other paragraphs in this story. A review of the China policies of the Trump administration's 23 cabinet and cabinet-level officials reveals that nearly all of them have adopted adversarial policies toward China or curtailed cooperation with the country. The Justice Department launched what it called a, quote, China initiative, which encouraged prosecutors to bring China-related espionage, theft, and hacking cases. The Education Department in 2019 started investigating foreign funding at U.S. universities. That prodded schools to abide by a legal requirement that many had ignored and report $6.5 billion in previously undisclosed foreign funding. Independent agencies such as the Federal Communications Commission also took action. The FCC has begun substantially curtailing Chinese access to U.S. telecommunications infrastructure. At the State Department, Mr. Pompeo has called for Americans to, quote, engage China as it is, not as we wish it were, end quote. Continuing, he says, quote, today we're finally realizing the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party is truly hostile to the United States and our values, end quote, Mr. Pompeo said in a policy speech on China last October. So there you have it, folks. The rhetoric is heating up. It's a political year. It will only intensify from here on out. Be ready for it. Be ready for it. That is the blame game. Thank you so much for joining me. Please like, share, subscribe, get the word out, leave your comments. We do love hearing from you. Stay diversified, stay vigilant, and stay with the Capital News. I am Alex Karitis. Godspeed.